Okay, so far we spent quite a bit of time learning about React. And so now in this video, we're going to start to learn Redux. And I'm going to tell you what Redux is first. Redux exactly, and then simply put, is pretty much a central data store for all of our application data. So in other words, Redux is in charge of handling data inside of our applications. And any component in our application will be able to access data from this central data store, and then therefore, it kind of actually makes state management very easy in React applications. So that's why we use Redux in our application. Now, it makes creating complex applications a little bit easier. And of course, we can absolutely create applications using React alone. But that's not really going to be the reality. What you do want to do is start to integrate Redux into applications that we are going to create, especially the more advanced ones. And believe me, it's going to make your life and the applications a whole lot easier than just using React alone. Okay, so imagine that this is a component structure of an application, and it might look like a fairly complex structure, but this really is a simple application with just a few components here. So imagine that we have a main content component that wants to show some data that we get from an external source. And then on the other hand, inside the About content, on the About page, we're also going to want to show the same data as well. So we want to kind of share that data, right? They both need that data inside the About content and the main content components. So I guess what we could do is in the Home component, we could reach out for some data from an external source and then store it in the state of this component and then pass it down as props to be a main content component. But what about the About content? I think we could probably do the same thing. We could reach out and put the data into the About page, get that data stored in the state, and then pass it down as props. But you see how that would be duplicating our code? So it's probably not going to be the most efficient, certainly not the best method for doing this. So, well, you know what? There's another way. We could also come up with a kind of convoluted way to pass the data. We could get data from here inside the Home component and then pick it up and pass it into the About content. And all right, so I can't even continue this. It's obviously very convoluted, not the best way of doing things. So what's the solution? Okay, we're going to use Redux. Are you ready? So as I said before, Redux is a central data store, and we can store all of our data that we're going to need for the application and anything that's going to need to be shared between components inside of this thing right here. So if this main content component wants some data, you can just reach out to the data into this Redux store and grab the data and then pass it down into this main content component. Okay, so if the About content wants to get the data as well, it can just reach out to the Redux store and grab that data. No convoluted method necessary. You don't need to pass data between different components around the whole application, and we certainly don't need to go about duplicating our code. All right, so yeah, it's a kind of a simplistic way to explain the solution that Redux offers us within an application. Because now, what if we wanted to change the data as well? We can do it from this About content component. The About content could make a change to the data. And then, therefore, the updated data is going to be passed to the main content. And also the update will show up elsewhere within the application. But they can't just directly edit it. that would be certainly unsafe within the application, as well as resulting in unpredictable code. So there is a particular process when we're working with Redux. Okay, so let's quickly look at how it all fits together. First of all, we define a central store with Redux, and that's where our data is going to be kept, in that central state. So if we want to access some of that data in a component, then the component can call on that data, and then a Redux passes that data in the form of props to that component. And that way we can access the data very easily. Okay? So then what happens if, in the future you want to make changes to data? We don't just go up to Redux and say, okay, make a change. You can't just change a property like this, right? So because this is a process, and because our application is predictable and the application should understand the process behind it, but also it's much easier to debug if there are errors thanks to a process. So I'll show you the process. First of all, we'll decide that we want to make a change. And after that, we will dispatch an action. And then the actions describe the changes that we want to make. So an action might be something like add a to-do, to add a new item to data, or delete to-do, to remove that item from the data. So we'll dispatch that action, and with that action, we can pass along an optional payload. And the payload is pretty much any kind of data that we want to pass along with it, right? So let's go to this example in the case of adding a new to-do item to the global state. We should pass along that new to-do data with that dispatch. So we're dispatching an action which describes the change that we're going to make, and that payload, which is the data that we want to add. Okay, so once we've done that step, that action is passed to what is known as a reducer, this thing right here. Then the reducer takes the action and it looks at the type of it and says, okay, this is an add to do action. So what I'm going to do is take this data that you've given me, and I'm going to go to the central data store and update it with this new data. So simply the reducer is the thing that actually updates the data store. And then all the changes are going to be made from here, not directly from components. So we go through this little process, and then we change the data in the state. Now, this all may seem a little bit complex. People always find that it's kind of challenging to understand at first. Redux, when they first get started, but when you first start out with Redux, it does tend to be a little bit challenging to understand. But I assure you that after a little while, you will eventually start to understand some of the different terminologies and the entire flow of the library. And then you'll hit that sort of magic tipping point where things just seem a whole lot easier. Okay, so in the next couple of videos, we're going to get through all the different diagrams, and it's going to help you understand. And we'll try to get through that as quick as we can. But as time goes on, without a doubt, it will get a whole lot easier. Okay, so just stick with it, and with a little bit of patience, we'll get there together. And I also promise you that once that you've worked with Redux for an hour or two and you get the hang of this process, then it's going to make your applications so much easier to manage, especially as they get bigger. So anyway, that's the theory, the philosophy, whatever, behind Redux. So let's take a look at another step. How are things actually kind of working within the Redux world? And that means that the next step in the next video, we'll break it all down for you. So we'll start out in CodePen, as always, just to explain the basics of the code and how we set up a Redux. And after that, we'll transfer the ideas and all that code into our application step by step. So I'm going to pause right here, and then when we come back, the next section, that means we'll dive into Redux.